Hey folks, this is Kalani. The pre-patch for Dragonflight will be in our laps this very next reset. It's literally right around the corner. That doesn't stop Blizzard from squeezing in some last minute balance tuning changes though. We have some buffs, we have a lot of nerfs, and there are even massive changes to some key racial abilities as we head into Dragonflight. So let's go through this latest round of balance changes, see who's getting buffed and who's getting nerfed just before the pre-patch goes live. Now before we jump in, be sure to hit up that like button and subscribe so you never miss another video. We're going to do this in alphabetical order as per usual, so we're starting with the Death Knight. There are only a few changes, more like fixes for Unholy Death Knight specifically. They fixed an issue where certain pets were not scaling with mastery or being affected by morbidity, so some extra damage should come through with those fixes in place. Demon Hunters will see a bit of back and forth this time. Immolation Aura was buffed up, but I-Beam and the Hunt have both been nerfed. The Illidari Knowledge and Will of the Illidari effects were both buffed up though. For Havoc specifically, Chaos Strike was nerfed, Blade Dance was buffed, Immolation Aura won't last as long, and there are quite a few talent nerfs thrown in as well. For Vengeance, the Elysian Decree damage reduction was removed, and quite a few buffs and nerfs to various passives and talents. Then we come to the Druids, and oh boy, it's another round of Boomkin nerfs, so strap yourself in. We actually have a couple changes to interactions, like how astral spells benefit from Eclipse, which talents and abilities scale with Eclipse and Mastery, which could actually increase the damage of quite a lot of these effects overall, and there are some additional synergies being implemented between different talents, so bonus effects should become a bit more valuable. They did make a change where specific effects cannot crit anymore, like Lunar Shrapnel, which isn't ideal, but then the big nerfs come in at the end. Boomkin Mastery damage increase was reduced by 45%. It used to be 9% baseline, I believe, and that was knocked down to 5%, so that's a huge decrease in overall power potential and will significantly reduce the value of Mastery stat for Boomkins, but then we also see a 35% reduction on Starfall. Now before you go too crazy about these nerfs, what's interesting about these balance changes is that some of them have already been reverted, but not quite all the way. So the previous Eclipse changes were totally reverted, so that 5% went back up to 15%. The Mastery nerf was reversed slightly, but not all the way, so that's now down to a 7% base. That's an increase from the initial 5% mark, but still down from the original 9% mark. And then Starfall's damage was bumped back up a bit to 12.5% of spell power from that initial nerf we just talked about. So still a nerf overall, but not quite as bad as the first round of nerfs. This also shows you that this is still a balancing act, right? They're trying to reach a good level, a solid measure of damage from each source for each class and spec. So Boomkins are still getting nerfed again, just not quite as bad as they could have been. And then to round out the Druid changes, Feral saw some talent shift around slightly, and Resto Druids will see a buff to Cenarius' Guidance, grant your clear casting more often, and also helping to reduce the cooldown of your Tree of Life a little bit more. Next up we have the Evokers. To start with, both Deep Breath effects, so both Deep Breath and Dreamflight, will now remove all roots when activated. That's actually going to be huge for mobility overall, and incredibly useful and powerful in PvP scenarios. Another general change for the Evokers that wasn't in the notes but was data mined is that Obsidian Scales has actually changed how it works. It used to increase your armor and reduce magic damage taken by 20%, but now it will actually reduce all damage taken by 30%, giving them a much better all-rounded defensive ability. Obsidian Scales' baseline cooldown was also set at 1.5 minutes, which used to have to be talented, and now the talent has actually changed to give you an additional charge of that defensive cooldown. So that's actually a massive buff to the overall potential of an Evoker's defensive cooldowns, which is great considering they were a little bit squishy before that. And then there are also some minor adjustments to talents and a bit of a rework for Dream Breath. It will now do the same healing at all ranks, but the portion of instant healing and heal over time will change depending on how long you charge the ability. So you can choose more instant upfront healing or more over time healing, depending on the situation you're in. That's pretty neat. There are also some extra effects and interactions that have been straightened out, but overall this looks like some nice quality of life updates for Evokers, especially the Evoker healers. Now for Hunters, the main focus is going to be on Beast Mastery, but there was also a big buff for the Arctic Bowler talent that's going to be doubled in both chance to proc and damage, so that's very nice. But for Beast Mastery specifically, Dire Beast related talents have been buffed yet again. There are a lot of bug fixes as well. Beast Cleave won't trigger from unrelated spells, Call of the Wild has had a lot of bugs addressed and fixed, and then Brutal Companion has also had a lot of bugs fixed and some quality of life updates thrown in to make sure it's not interacting with focus in a weird way. It's worth noting noting that Brutal Companion's damage was also slashed in half, which will hurt that talent quite a bit, but it should prove to be a good talent anyway. Now, something that was caught in data mining but was not included in the actual notes is that Barbed Shot was also nerfed from 45% attack power down to 35%, so that might be an unintended change, or it might just have been overlooked. In a later hotfix, Survival also saw some changes. Flanking Strike, Fury of the Eagle, Kill Command and Kill Shot were all buffed up quite a bit, so you'll be dishing out some extra damage with those abilities, and then the Ruthless Marauder talent was also buffed to empower Fury of the Eagle at higher health percentages, which is quite an interesting change to that talent actually. And then we come to the mages. We've only got changes for fire, and it's a round of nerfs, I'm afraid. Pyroblast damage was reduced, and the effectiveness of various talents and passives was also knocked down a few notches. Thankfully, there's nothing majorly massive going on, but your overall damage will go down with these changes in play. Moving on, we come to the monks. For Mistweaver, there are quite a few bug fixes, which is always nice to see. Bugs getting in the way of your sweet heals is always very annoying, but there are also some slight buffs thrown in for good measure as well. For Windwalker, there were a couple changes to Storm, Earth and Fire, which should hopefully make it more reliable and do what it's supposed to do. Thunderfist damage was increased by quite a bit. Fury of Zuen now gives you a flat 10% haste, and they fixed a bug related to the Zuen spawned from Fury of Zuen. For the Paladins, it's only Holy with some changes in this round, and they all seem to be slight buffs. We have increased ranges, increased healing and effective bonuses, and generally just a few small buffs to passives or talents. For the priests, Shadow is going to see quite a few changes, mostly to how spells work and interact. Various target caps were increased or decreased, certain abilities will hit more targets with a focus on how Echoing Void works. There are also some changes to Shadowy Apparitions, mostly in an effort to reduce visual clutter, it sounds like, but also to give you extra options for AoE. The Idol of Yogg-Saron has been redesigned, so every time you create a Shadowy Apparition you get a stack, and at 25 stacks you summon a thing from beyond to attack your targets. Sounds like a lot of fun for an insane void-wielding crazy priest. There are also some couple changes to Void Spike right there at the end. Moving on, we come to the rogues. Now, rogues have seen quite a few nerfs throughout the last rounds of balance tuning, and it looks like we're actually heading in the opposite way for once. To start with, Rupture, Ambush, Instant Poison, and Wound Poison were all buffed quite considerably, and in the class tree, Shiv, Sepsis, and Echoing Reprimand were all buffed up as well. For Assassination specifically, oh boy, what a list of buffs. That's pretty much a large buff across the board, and most of their main key abilities will see a large increase in overall damage. So if you were sad to see some earlier Assassination nerfs, this might just wipe those nerfs from your memory. It's not all good news though. Outlaws still seem to be on the nerf end of the balance tuning bat. Dispatch and pistol shot damage was reduced, and quite a few buffs in the Roll the Bones ability were nerfed as well. We do see some buffs creep in at the end there with a list of bonus effects though, so hopefully they're going to offset a little bit of the damage nerfs here. And then for subtlety, we have quite a few nerfs as well. They aren't all that large, it's just quite a few smaller nerfs chipping away at overall damage and effectiveness of certain abilities and passives. Now moving on, the Shamans are in for a bit of a treat. To start with, Elemental will see some very nice buffs. Lightning Bolt, Elemental Blast, Earth Shock, Lava Surges from Heatwave, and Liquid Magma Totem were all buffed up quite a bit, so expect to see some extra damage with these changes in play. And then Enhancement has a long list of changes. Maelstrom Weapon trigger chance was lowered, and damage of Maelstrom Weapon consuming abilities was also reduced, and there was a Conduit nerf thrown in there for good measure as well. But Storm Strike, Wind Strike, Lava Lash, Ice Strike, Sundering, Storm's Wrath, Gathering Storms, Fire Nova, and Feral Spirit have all seen significant buffs. There is a nerf in there for Hot Hand, which reduces the power of that buff specifically, but you also have a 92% buff to Lava Lash, so that will offset the Hot Hand nerf quite considerably. It looks like Doom Winds was also nerfed right at the very end there, but overall some big buffs to baseline enhancement damage. Now the Warlocks are next, and they don't have too many changes sadly, it's only Demonology in this round, but it does look like they'll see a few nerfs and a couple of buffs. The first half here, all those abilities have been halved, so Dreadlash, Felon Steel, Infernal Command and Felsunder will be half as powerful as they were previously. On the flip side, Demonic Tyrant's Demon Fire damage was increased by 50%, so that's a very nice buff there, and then we've also seen a few bug fixes as well. Moving on to the warriors. Blood and Thunder has been slightly redesigned, which could end up being very useful for AoE scenarios. Arms warriors are in for a round of nerfs in this build. Their auto attack damage has been decreased. In for the kills haste buff has been reduced. Skull Splitter will generate less rage and deal less damage. Mortal Strike was nerfed. Execute was nerfed slightly, and Juggernaut won't stack quite as high, and damage over time effects have had their damage reduced as well. On the flip side, Fury will see quite a few buffs. Damage of key abilities has been increased by a decent amount. There is some increases to bonus damage and effects. Dancing Blades now also increases auto attack damage, and both Onslaught and Titanic Rage now trigger Enrage before dealing damage, so their damage will always benefit from the Enrage effect, which is a very nice buff. Now, Protection is a bit of a mixed bag and seems to be more focused on fixes rather than straight nerfs or buffs, but for the most part they seem to be positive, so Protection is still looking great going into the pre-patch. That's all for the class changes in this round. If your class or spec was not mentioned, that just means it didn't see any changes this week so far specifically, but the dev team has explicitly said this is not over. Tuning is not final, and they are working on pushing more and more tuning changes, buffs and nerfs into the current builds, especially with hotfixes, so a lot more could change by the time pre-patch arrives. That's kinda crazy, considering we're moving into pre-patch with the very next weekly reset, but I guess balancing doesn't really matter for pre-patch. Balancing actually only matters for when we get to max level in Dragonflight, so as long as things work at max level in Dragonflight, I'll be happy. I actually don't think the dev team should be focused on the end of Shadowlands at this point, so if something is broken next week and is doing way too much damage, I actually think that's fine, as long as it's reined in and tuned down before Dragonflight arrives. That's the real key there. We all want to be in a nice spot when Dragonflight Season 1 comes around, so we don't feel completely worthless going into dungeons or into the new raid or anything like that. I'm assuming that's their target goal. And then to round out this video, the last big change coming through just before pre-patch is going to be for the Drakthea race specifically. Now, we won't see the fruits of these particular changes until we're on the Dragon Isles, but the changes are going to be huge. The Soar racial will now benefit from the dragon riding talent tree, or at least from some of the points. Specifically, the max speed of Soar will be increased up to the same max speed of dragon riding itself when the Take to the Skies trait is learned. Dynamic stretching, restorative travels, and yearning for the sky all reduce the cooldown of Soar by 40 seconds, reducing it to a 2-minute cooldown when all those traits are learned. If you then add in the Familiar Skies racial ability, which requires you to fully explore the Dragon Isles, that knocks your Soar cooldown all the way down to just 1 minute. And then when you unlock the Winds of the Isles, that will also work for Soar as well. So all in all, you'll be able to soar way more often, and Soar is going to be much better overall if you unlock some of the dragon riding talents in the Dragon Isles, which, let's be honest, we're all going to do. So that's a massive buff to Soar overall, but that's the class changes in this week's build and the last week before we head into pre-patch, so these are some very last minute changes, and apparently we should expect to see even more. But how do you feel about this round of changes? Are there any classes you think still need a lot of attention, and which classes do you think look good or bad going into pre-patch? Leave all your thoughts in the comment section below. A big thank you to all of our supporters over on Patreon and to our members here on YouTube. You can see the names floating by on screen. If you want to add your name to this list, you can find links over to Patreon in the description or click the join button just below the video. If you want to see more videos like this, make sure to subscribe and ring that notification bell so you never miss another video. Thanks for watching, folks. Good luck and have fun, and as always, I will see you next time.